Welcome to Xi Jinping Briefing. The content of the briefing includes: China continues its search for a maritime military presence in West Africa. China should be wary of the trap of history. Russia is losing the economic war, the West must not lose its nerve now. China protests due to labor, property issues rise, report says. Who's afraid of freedom? China continues its search for a maritime military presence in West Africa. Diplomat. China's attempts to establish a military base in West Africa, specifically in Gabon, are part of its larger strategy to achieve a global maritime presence. The Chinese government has been investing in port ownership abroad and has already established a military base in Djibouti. It has also considered other potential locations for bases, including Equatorial Guinea, Kenya, Nigeria, Namibia, and the Solomon Islands. China's efforts to establish a maritime presence have raised concerns among other countries, particularly the US, as it would bring the Chinese military closer to US territory in the Atlantic. The US has started to respond to China's strategy by combining commercial investments with government action to hinder China's efforts. However, a more comprehensive strategy is needed, including commercial investments, diplomatic conversations, and security partnerships, to effectively respond to China's search for maritime presence abroad. China should be wary of the trap of history. Diplomat. China is increasingly using history as a tool in its diplomacy, with negative historical narratives being evoked in an attempt to challenge contested narratives and shift the focus of criticism. Previously, China had used positive aspects of its historical grandeur and cultural heritage in its public diplomacy efforts, but the recent shift towards negative history is seen as a response to rising nationalism and a desire to assert China's vision of international relations as opposed to Western imperialism. This change in historical statecraft is likely to have domestic and non-Western appeal, but it may undermine China's long-term aspirational appeal as an alternative to the US-led international order. Instead of positioning itself as a peaceful and cooperative rising power, China is adopting a more confident and assertive posture. This use of negative history may reinforce Western perceptions of China as a recalcitrant competitor seeking revenge, rather than a constructive global leader. The reliance on history as a tool in diplomacy is seen as a potential trap, as it can be difficult to de-emphasize the power of historical narratives. Russia is losing the economic war, the West must not lose its nerve now. Telegraph. Russia's economy is on the brink of exhaustion due to its increased defense spending and the war in Ukraine, according to the Telegraph. Defense spending has tripled since the invasion of Ukraine and now accounts for about 8% of national output. This has distorted Russia's GDP figures, which show growth of 3% predicted for 2023 and 2.6% for 2024, leading to a sense of confusion and despair among some commentators. Furthermore, Russia's rearmament boom has stalled and its economy is struggling with declining revenues from the energy sector, delayed projects, and sanctions loopholes being closed. There are also reports of shortages of spare parts for hard drives, controllers, motherboards, data storage and engines for shipbuilding, as well as empty shelves in supermarkets. The liquid assets of the National Wealth Fund have fallen from 6.6% to 2.7% of GDP since the war began. China protests due to labor, property issues rise, report says. Bloomberg. China experienced a surge in protests in the fourth quarter of 2022, with 952 dissent events recorded, according to Freedom House's China Dissent Monitor project. The majority of incidents, 61%, were related to labor issues, while 17% were linked to housing. Guangdong, a manufacturing hub, saw the highest number of protests. The rising number of protests adds to concerns about China's economic recovery. The country's youth unemployment reached a record high of 21.3% in June 2022. While protests are not uncommon in China, they are typically small and focused on local issues. The fear of reprisal and tight controls over the internet make it rare for people to direct criticism at the higher echelons of power. Who's afraid of freedom? Foreign affairs. The British political philosopher John Gray and the Yale intellectual historian Samuel Moyn, two academics turned public intellectuals, have both weighed in on what they see as the self-inflicted decline of the liberal project. Although they agree that liberal democracy has, in some sense, failed, what they mean by liberalism and what they see as its prospects diverge sharply. In The New Leviathans, Gray contends that liberalism is a fundamentally erroneous creed built on dangerous myths and illusions. Rather than bringing freedom, it has led to unfettered government power that has brought much of the world to the brink of totalitarianism. By contrast, in Liberalism Against Itself, Moyn argues that liberal thought is fundamentally sound, based as it is on ideals that are both laudable and realizable. As Moyne sees it, the present crisis has been caused not by liberalism but by its betrayal, by none other than the architects of the liberal order themselves. Abandoning their core values and principles, he argues, liberalism's champions have become timid and anxious, more concerned with fending off their enemies than winning new converts. Where Gray sees liberal states growing into ever more controlling monsters, Moyne finds them reduced and enfeebled, having presided over the tragic dismantling of the welfare state. The real roots of Xi Jinping thought. Foreign affairs. Chinese President Xi Jinping is attempting to redefine China's ideological underpinnings by pairing Marxism with Confucianism. This effort is part of Xi's broader project to reconceptualize China's ideological identity and assert the party's control over Chinese society. Xi believes that Marxism and Confucianism are compatible and that Marxism should be considered the soul of modern China, while traditional Chinese culture should be seen as the root. However, this attempt to synthesize the two philosophies has been met with skepticism and even mockery, both within and outside of China. In his book The Rise of Modern Chinese Thought, Wang Hui explores the historical connections between political theory and governance in China. He argues that Chinese Marxism emerged not as a rejection of Confucianism, but rather as a continuation of the efforts by late Qing dynasty thinkers to apply Confucian thought to the challenges of modernity. These thinkers sought to reconcile Chinese cultural traditions with new ideas from the West, including Marxism. Wang's analysis suggests that the synthesis of Marxism and Confucianism is not as implausible as it may seem. China's attempts to redefine its ideology are driven by a sense of crisis and a desire to address the country's economic slowdown and growing public distrust. Xi's efforts to fuse Marxism with Confucianism are an attempt to provide a sense of stability and legitimacy to the party's rule. However, Wang's work also highlights the importance of intellectual diversity and debate in Chinese thought. The CCP's efforts to control and limit ideological discourse may ultimately hinder China's ability to address its challenges and find a path forward. India's feet of clay. Foreign affairs. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's authoritarian leadership style and his party's Hindu nationalist agenda threaten India's democratic institutions and its future as a global power, warns writer and historian Ramachandra Guha. Modi's domination of Indian politics, his centralization of power, and his attempts to impose Hindu hegemony on the country undermine the principles of religious pluralism and federalism that have been key to India's success as a democracy, Guha argues. While Modi remains popular and has achieved some economic progress, his government has also intensified social divisions, neglected environmental concerns, and eroded democratic freedoms. The international community, including the US, has largely overlooked these issues, attracted by India's economic potential and its role as a counterweight to China. Guha predicts that India's future may resemble that of Sri Lanka rather than the Asian tigers, if majoritarianism continues to erode the country's pluralism. Kissinger and the true meaning of détente. Foreign affairs. The concept of détente, pioneered by Henry Kissinger during the Cold War, is making a comeback in U.S. foreign policy as policymakers seek to navigate the tense relationship with China. Détente is not about friendship, but about reducing the risks of conflict and finding areas of cooperation. It involves engaging with the rival power on various issues while also being prepared to confront any attempts to expand influence. This approach recognizes the need for coexistence and containment in a world where nuclear weapons and global challenges like climate change and AI compel major rivals to work together. Détente fell out of fashion in the 1970s due to criticisms from both the left and right. Critics on the left accused Kissinger of prioritizing containment over human rights and supporting dictators. Critics on the right argued that Kissinger's policy was appeasement that enabled Soviet expansion. However, détente was successful in avoiding a world war and improving the lives of people under communist rule. It allowed the US to regroup, stabilize its Cold War strategy, and create economic and technological assets that led to its victory. The lessons of détente are relevant to the current competition between the US and China. While there are calls for a tough approach towards China to deter aggression, a new détente approach may be more preferable to prevent a potential conflict over Taiwan. Engaging in negotiations on various issues, including arms control, trade, technology, climate change, and space, can help reduce tensions and provide opportunities for cooperation. The US and China need to find a middle ground between containment and coexistence, recognizing the limits of their power and the need for strategic stability. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Dr. Six, your resident observer from the 6 Degrees world. Today, we've covered a range of topics, from China's search for a maritime military presence in West Africa, to its use of history as a diplomatic tool, Russia's struggling economy, China's rising protests, the decline of liberalism, the roots of Xi Jinping thought, the challenges facing India, and the concept of détente. It's been quite a whirlwind of news, but fear not, I'm here to provide some analysis and share my thoughts with you. Let's start with China's search for a maritime military presence in West Africa. This is part of China's larger strategy to achieve a global maritime presence, and it has already established a military base in Djibouti. The US, in particular, is concerned about China's efforts, as it would bring the Chinese military closer to US territory in the Atlantic. While the US has started to respond by combining commercial investments with government action, a more comprehensive strategy is needed to effectively counter China's search for maritime presence abroad. Next, we discussed China's use of history as a diplomatic tool. China has shifted towards evoking negative historical narratives in an attempt to challenge contested narratives and assert its vision of international relations. While this may have domestic and non-Western appeal, it could undermine China's long-term aspirational appeal as an alternative to the US-led international order. The reliance on history as a tool in diplomacy can be a potential trap, as it can be difficult to de-emphasize the power of historical narratives. Moving on to Russia's struggling economy, we learned that its increased defense spending and the war in Ukraine have put a strain on its finances. Defense spending has tripled since the invasion of Ukraine, and the economy is struggling with declining revenues and shortages of essential goods. This is a significant blow to Russia and highlights the importance of sustainable economic policies. China also experienced a surge in protests, with labor and property issues being the main drivers. Protests are not uncommon in China, but the rising number adds to concerns about the country's economic recovery. The youth unemployment rate reached a record high, and people are becoming more vocal about their grievances. This highlights the challenges China faces in managing social unrest. We also delved into the decline of liberalism and the concept of détente. While some argue that liberalism has failed, others believe that it has been betrayed by its own champions. Détente, pioneered by Henry Kissinger, is making a comeback as policymakers seek to navigate the tense relationship with China. It involves engaging with the rival power on various issues while being prepared to confront any attempts to expand influence. This approach recognizes the need for coexistence and containment in a world where major rivals must work together on global challenges. Lastly, we discussed the roots of Xi Jinping thought and the challenges facing India. She is attempting to redefine China's ideological underpinnings by pairing Marxism with Confucianism. This is part of his broader project to assert the party's control over Chinese society. However, this attempt has been met with skepticism. As for India, Prime Minister Narendra Modi's authoritarian leadership style and Hindu nationalist agenda threaten the country's democratic institutions and its future as a global power. These issues should not be overlooked by the international community. So, there you have it, a roundup of the latest news. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you make of China's search for a maritime military presence? How do you feel about the use of history as a diplomatic tool? And what about the challenges facing Russia, China, and India? Don't be shy, let's dive into a lively discussion together. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.